Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 628. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today is July 3rd, 2024. So for the rest of this week, I am planning not to do a show tomorrow on July 4th. I'm just going to try to take it easy that day. That said, if some major news happens today, maybe the U.S. government or somebody's trying to get something out before a long holiday weekend, I will do a show tomorrow and then probably take Friday off. So just going to depend a little bit on the level of news today. It's been a slower week compared to some of the recent extremely busy and extremely heavy news weeks that we've had to cover on this show. All right. So if you're a new listener to the show, be sure you subscribe to it somewhere. It's up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee, and anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. If you want to recommend it to people, the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the news stories that's in the news section of that website. I'm also the opinion editor of antiwar.com, and I put together the viewpoints over there. And the show gets reposted in the blog section on antiwar.com. I've added quite a few new listeners in recent weeks. This is in part, I think, due to my appearances. Of course, I've been on Judge Knapp's show, a regular for most of this year, but also on the Tom Woods show and the Human Action podcast hosted by Bob Murphy. I've had, a lot of new people. I've gotten some new recommendations, so I'm going to try to start instilling those in the show next week. Hopefully, it'll be an improvement. So, as always, I'm interested in feedback. Do read most of the YouTube comments and things like that, so I really appreciate it. If you haven't listened to those shows, particularly the Human Action podcast, I've gotten really great feedback from my performance there, so check that out. Really appreciate it. Let's get into the episode today. First up here, this article by Dave DeCamp, July 2nd, antiwar.com. Austin says the U.S. will provide Ukraine with new $2.3 billion weapons package. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin hosted his Ukrainian counterpart in Washington on Tuesday and said the U.S. would soon announce a new $2.3 billion weapons package for Ukraine. Austin said, "I am proud the United States will soon announce more than $2.3 billion in new security assistance for Ukraine." Austin said the package would include air defense interceptors, anti-tank weapons, and other munitions. It will be provided through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to ship weapons to Ukraine directly from Pentagon stockpiles. The Pentagon chief also vowed the U.S. would continue supporting Ukraine and fueling the proxy war. And the United States will never waver in our support. Alongside some 50 allies and partners, will continue to provide the critical capabilities that Ukraine needs to push back Russian aggression today and deter Russian aggression tomorrow, he said. Austin's meeting comes about a week before the U.S. will host a NATO summit in Washington from July 8th to July 11th. The Ukrainian defense minister said he hoped Ukraine would be invited to join NATO sometime soon. And so I think this may be why the U.S. is announcing such a big weapons package here coming up, is because they essentially need to bribe the Ukrainians not to make a scene. Zelensky could come to Washington and throw a hissy fit on the floor, and it would really expose that the Biden administration has, one, never been serious. We said we got to fight this war with Russia. Before the war, we had an opportunity. The U.S. had an opportunity, as well as some rebalancing of the security situation in Europe, but we could have generally avoided this war by by announcing that we were closing the door to NATO, that Georgia and Ukraine would not become future member states. That's all we had to do, because this isn't going to happen anyway. So we could have said before this war that was never going to happen, and that would have taken the war off the table. However, in the land of DC propaganda, you can't say that. You can't close the door to NATO because Putin is the new Hitler, and by closing the door to NATO, you are making concessions to Putin. So this caused a lot of problems for the Biden administration. And again, rather than dealing with the reality of the situation on the ground, that was, one, Ukraine was never going to become a member of NATO, and two, Russia was willing to go to war, if the U.S. made Ukraine a de facto member of NATO, which had happened in 2021, that, created this war. And so now we are fighting this war because we want to say that Ukraine could one day become a member of NATO. And until that time, effectively treat Ukraine as a member of NATO, meaning we're going to train Ukrainian troops, give Ukrainian NATO weapons, make sure they have a modern, Western built military, and also get access to NATO intelligence sharing. They go to all the NATO meetings, they host NATO war games, all these things. Another thing to consider from the Russian perspective, the U.S. has developed these Typhoon missile launchers that are concealed in a 40-foot shipping container. And we know recently, we did this both, I believe, in Denmark and definitely in the Philippines. We deployed these to those countries for war games. And so if NATO is hosting war games in Ukraine, I'm sure Russia has pretty heightened concerns that the U.S. is doing that to smuggle weapons into Ukraine. And, we leave just a few extra shipping containers behind, and suddenly the U.S. is capable of hitting Moscow with nuclear-tipped Tomahawk cruise missiles, missiles just from a few hundred miles away in Kiev or in eastern Ukraine. So this is understandably seen as a pretty major threat by Russia. So we have Ukraine fighting this war that will one day lead them to being in NATO. At the same time, again, Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. And so Ukraine essentially just bleeding itself for the West to hurt Russia. And at this upcoming NATO summit, we don't want Zelensky making a big fuss about not being able to join NATO, because all the cretins in Washington, D.C. will be there, and they might see, oh, hey, the Ukrainian president saying you're never going to allow me to join the alliance. What the heck is going on? So, I think this is something the White House wants to avoid, and I think they're going to lavish Ukraine with a lot of weapons and promises in the next week or so in order to get Zelensky quiet during that meeting. So Dave wraps up his article here with a comment from the Ukrainian defense minister. He said, "We look forward to discussing with you how we could continue our partnership in the future, a member of NATO. Hopefully soon Ukraine receives its invitation. There's no indication that this is Dave. There's no indication that NATO will extend a formal invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance anytime soon. A bilateral security deal between President Biden and Ukrainian President Zelensky, signed in June, repeated a vague promise made at NATO's Vilnius summit last year that Ukraine would get an invite to join the alliance when allies agree conditions are met, which doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen." All right, this article is interesting, again from Dave DeCamp. Hungary's Orban visits Ukraine, suggests Zelensky consider a ceasefire. So the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban made his first wartime visit to Ukraine on Tuesday and suggested to Ukrainian President Zelensky that he agree to a ceasefire with Russia. Zelensky's so-called peace formula, which he has been pushing as a way to end the war, requires a full Russian withdrawal from Ukraine before negotiations can even happen, a non-starter for talks with Moscow. Orban said he told Zelensky that he should consider agreeing to a ceasefire first. Orban said, "I asked the president to think about whether he would reverse the order and speed up peace talks with making a ceasefire first. A ceasefire connected to a deadline would give a chance to speed up peace talks. I explored this possibility with the president. I am grateful for his honest answers and negotiation." So the deputy head of Ukraine's presidential office later said Zelensky dismissed Orban's proposal. They said the president of Ukraine listened to him, but in response, he stated Ukraine's position clear and understandable and well known. While Hungary is a NATO member, Orban has become one of the most prominent European critics of the proxy war in Ukraine. He has repeatedly delayed EU aid packages to Ukraine and softened some of the sanctions on Russia. Orban does not allow his country's territory to be used to transfer weapons to Ukraine. Since February 2022, Orban has consistently called for peace talks and ceasefire in Ukraine, putting him at odds with the U.S. and other NATO countries. The U.S. has discouraged peace talks throughout the war, including in March of April of 2022, when an actual peace deal was on the table. Also, Ukraine and the Washington dismissed Putin's recent offer for peace talks. So Doesn't seem like this war will be coming to an end anytime soon, unless the end of that conflict is a complete Russian military victory that forces Kiev to basically sign an agreement dictated to them by Moscow. I mean, even at this late hour, it does seem reasonable to believe that Ukraine does have some leverage and probably could use that leverage to get some of its territory back from Russia. But if it ends up that Russia is on the brink of taking Kiev, or the Ukrainian military has completely and utterly collapsed, well, then there's not going to be really any room for the West and Ukraine to broker here. They're just going to have to accept what Putin dictates to them, and they'll hope he has to suggest something that is somewhat reasonable and workable, so Russia doesn't have a massive problem on its hand years into the future. Of course, maybe that's what the US is counting on, right? We keep Ukraine fighting and fighting, right? And this causes Russia to take more and more Ukrainian territory. And as they take more and more Ukrainian territory, it's no longer Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Crimea, which are all very Russian areas of Ukraine, and probably will not be ripe, although there may be some people within those territories that are either unhappy now to live under Moscow's control versus Kiev, or maybe Russian forces killed some of their relatives, something like that, throughout this conflict, and really hate Russia, and conduct some kind of insider attack against Russia. I would assume that Putin is aware that if he starts to take areas of Ukraine that are much more populated by ethnic Ukrainians, then he's going to have more insurgency within territory that he now claims as Russia, which would, I'm sure, present a serious problem for the Russians. And so, again, hopefully Putin is a little bit reasonable in whatever he ultimately dictates to Ukraine, but it does seem like it's going to be essentially him writing out what Ukraine has to accept at this point. The West is never going to let Ukraine stop fighting. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on July 2nd. Staffer Resigns says working for Biden makes you complicit in genocide. Another U.S. official has resigned from their post over President Joe Biden's support for the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. A dozen members of the administration have publicly resigned in protest of the White House assistance to Tel Aviv and signed a letter blasting the president's policy. So this is Maryam Hassanin, and she is the third political appointee to resign from the Biden administration, and she told the Huffington Post, "I came to understand that even if the agency I'm working at is not producing foreign policy, serving in the administration in any capacity does essentially make you complicit in the genocide of Palestinians." She served as the special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Land and Mineral Management in the Interior Department. At age 24, she represents a large number of young Americans who believe Israel's treatment of Palestinians in Gaza amounts to a genocide. She was an enthusiastic Biden voter in 2020, hoping for justice for Muslims and other underrepresented groups. She wrote in her resignation announcement, "Marginalized communities in our country have long been denied the justice they deserve. I joined the Biden-Harris administration with the belief that my voice and diverse perspective would lend a hand in the pursuit of that justice. Through their policy choices and dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims, it has become clear to me that I do not have a place in this administration." Over the last 8 months, at least 12 U.S. officials have resigned over Biden's near unconditional support for Israel. Those who have resigned in protest say more officials are quietly stepping away from the government. Josh Paul, a former State Department official who was the first to publicly resign in October, estimates there are dozens more staffers who have left Biden's administration over the Israel policy. Since the war kicked off last October, the White House has sent Tel Aviv tens of thousands of bombs that have been used on civilian targets. The administration has also defended Israel against international accusations that it is committing a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. On Tuesday, Hassanian joined the 11 other officials in publicly resigning and released a letter saying that Biden is violating the Foreign Assistance Act and the Leahy laws. The letter said, "It is abundantly clear that the administration is currently willfully violating multiple U.S. laws, attempting to deny or distort facts, use loopholes, or manipulate the process to ensure a continuous flow of lethal weapons to Israel." And this is essentially what we've seen day in and day out at the State Department press briefings. I really think if the American people took the time to watch even a few, like 1 week's worth of those State Department press conference briefings, you would understand why people are so outraged about the U.S. war in Israel. It's not that the U.S. government doesn't know and doesn't understand that Israel is committing a lot of war crimes in Gaza, but rather they just continue to make excuses and find loopholes. And if they're ever really pinned up against the wall, they say, oh, bring it up with the Israelis. Of course, the Israelis aren't going to answer the questions, and the Israelis are committing these crimes with American-made bombs that we've sent to them since October 7th. And so it's not like the net shipment of U.S. bombs to Israel isn't what's going to allow them to continue to carry out these attacks. But the Biden administration just obviously knows that their weapons are being used to commit war crimes, but they see a politically impossible challenge where they can't curtail support for Israel in any way, or that would cost them politically in the United States. So I just wrap up my article here with: the letter condemns Biden's Israel policy as a, quote, failure and threat to the United States national security, America's diplomatic cover for and continuous flow of arms to Israel has ensured our indefinable complicity in the killings and forced starvations of the besieged Palestinian population in Gaza. The letter adds, this is not only morally reprehensible and a clear violation of international humanitarian law and U.S. laws, but it has also put a target on America's back. And that is something I've really tried to stress over the past 8 months. And I don't want to make that the biggest issue, right? That someday in the future, Americans may die, because there are actively Palestinians dying every single day. I mean, we'll get to some of those horrors coming up here next. There's the potential that this war expands to Lebanon. And so there's plenty of reasons to oppose this policy, just based on the moral grounds and what's happening to the people of the Middle East. But also on budgetary grounds, of course, we can't afford this war. We can't even afford our own wars. And so the idea that we're sending Israel $20 billion in weapons this year is just absurdly ridiculous. And again, something that we're going to have to, we can't afford, so we have to borrow that money, and then we're going to have to pay interest on that money. But not only that, this is something that is creating an immense amount of hatred, intense hatred for Americans. And you'll understand a little bit why after these next two stories. This one, Dave DeCamp, July 2nd, antiwar.com. Family that evacuated Khan units slaughtered by Israeli strike in so-called safe zone. So 9 members of the same family who evacuated Khan units were killed by an Israeli strike on Tuesday in an area of the central Gaza city, Deir al-Bala, that Israel called the so-called safe zone. Around a dozen members of the Haddan family fled Khan Yunis after Israel gave evacuation orders for the eastern portion of the city, which the UN said will impact around 250,000 Palestinians. The family found refuge with its standard relatives in Deir al-Bala, only for most of them to be slaughtered. According to the Associated Press, a total of 12 people were killed in the Israeli strike on the safe zone, including 5 children and 3 women. Israel has repeatedly bombed areas it declared safe in Gaza, including the Al-Mawasi camp on the coast, which is where the Israeli military said Palestinians evacuating Khan Yunis should go. After Israel ordered the evacuation of Khan Yunis, it launched airstrikes in the city that killed at least 9 people, including 3 children and 2 women. The strikes were launched near the European hospital, which is also in the area Israel said should be evacuated. Patients and workers from the European hospital, the largest operating medical facility in Gaza after the Israeli evacuation order. a nurse the head of the hospital's nursing department told the Washington Post some of the patients were dragged in hospital beds towards the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis by their families. Some of them were transported by ambulance, and some of them went out on foot. So the Israeli forces withdrew from Khan Yunis back in April after a brutal assault that destroyed more than 80% of the city's buildings, and most of the rest were uninhabitable. The evacuation order signals another invasion might be coming, despite Israel's claiming to have defeated Hamas in the city, and also Israeli leadership saying that they were going to wind down some operations in Gaza to focus on war with Lebanon. All right, so next up here, this one's a pretty interesting story. Israeli generals want truce in Gaza, putting them at odds with Netanyahu. So Israel's top generals want a ceasefire in Gaza, even if it keeps Hamas in power, putting them at odds with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the New York Times reported on Wednesday. The report, which cited current and former security officials, said one reason Israel's top brass favored a pause in Gaza was so that the Israeli military could recuperate to prepare for a full-blown war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. They believe a ceasefire in Gaza could reduce tensions on the Israeli-Lebanon border and possibly make it easier to reach a deal with Lebanon, although the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has previously said a pause in Gaza would allow for an escalation in Lebanon. The Israeli military also believes a deal with Hamas is the best way to safely free the remaining Israeli hostages in Gaza. The military is in full support of a hostage deal and ceasefire. The former Israeli National Security Advisor Ehel Yuhalta told the Times. Responding to a report, Netanyahu vowed military operations in Gaza would continue until Hamas was eliminated, a goal the Israeli military has publicly said is not possible. So Netanyahu said, "I don't know who these anonymous sources are, but I'm here to make it unequivocally clear this will not happen. The war will end once Israel achieves all of its objectives, including the destruction of Hamas and the release of all of our hostages." Four Israeli senior officials who spoke with the Times agreed that a hostage deal that keeps Hamas in power for now is the least worst option for Israel at this moment. The former security official also made it clear that the Israeli military's thinking is for a temporary ceasefire, not a permanent truce that Hamas has been seeking. He said they believe that they can always go back and engage Hamas militarily in the future. Axios previously reported that Israeli officials thought a ceasefire deal unveiled by President Biden back in May was vague enough that Israel and Hamas could enter a temporary ceasefire and conduct a prisoner swap without Israel actually committing a permanent truce. But Netanyahu repeatedly rejected the idea of a permanent ceasefire, leading Hamas to ask for stronger guarantees and sabotaging the chances of an agreement. So, just I guess one or two things I want to add on here. It does seem interesting, this split between Netanyahu and his military. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out, but it does seem to me that Netanyahu probably has more power and maybe even more popularity in Israel than the leadership of the IDF. And now another thing to keep in mind here is, with this split between Netanyahu and his military, there may be a very quick and easy reaction to say, well, the military is clearly the sensible party here, and Netanyahu is just blinded by his desire to stay in power because he knows if he leaves power, he may possibly go to jail. And there may be a lot of truth to that. I'm not dismissing that. I also want to point out that I think Netanyahu probably has his pulse on America, the political situation in America very well. And while again, at least a part or even a lot of this may be Netanyahu's desire to stay in power, I also think Netanyahu understands the political situation in the United States, and that if this war stops, it will be harder for it to restart again, in part because if it stops, I think journalists are going to almost necessarily start to enter Gaza, and then you're going to see the true scale of the destruction. The genocide will be harder to deny. They will find a lot of the bodies that are buried under the rubble. They will count the dead more accurately, and the true death toll will be far more accurate. And that may be enough that the U.S. would not return to supporting Israel in this conflict. I think the other thing Netanyahu realizes is this war going on through the election season and the political stances of the American politicians makes it so that the debate is between giving Israel unconditional support and giving Israel unconditional support plus 10. Right, that's really the difference between Netanyahu and Trump at this point. All right, next up, this is a rather disturbing article from the Palestine Chronicle. Israeli National Security Minister demands death penalty for detained Palestinians to solve prison overcrowding. So, from the article, Israel's far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has reiterated the death penalty for Palestinian detainees as a much simpler solution to overcrowding in Israeli jails, as officials continue to trade accusations over the issues sparked by the release of the director of Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. The Shin Bet, the General Security Service, accused the Israeli government and Ben-Gvir of ignoring months of warnings that huge amounts of additional detainee space was needed to absorb the thousands of new detainees due to the ongoing military offensive in Gaza, reported the Anadolu news agency, which is a Turkish outlet. So, Itamar Ben-Gvir said in a lengthy statement on X on Tuesday, since I assumed the position of Minister of National Security, one of the highest goals I have set for myself is to worsen the conditions of the terrorists in the prisons and to reduce their rights to a minimum required by law. He added, everything published about the abominable conditions of Palestinians detainees was true, including they ruled the prisons without question and did whatever they pleased. Now, I'm not sure if he is just being a little bit hyperbolic here, because if he's saying everything that's been published has been true, last week the Israeli outlet 972 magazine, the Hebrew version of that outlet, published an article from a detainee who was the first Palestinian imagine this. This has been going on for 9 months. The first time that a Palestinian detainee from Gaza has been interviewed by a lawyer in an Israeli prison was the middle of June, which, you know, is in itself a massive human rights violation, right? There's a reason they're not letting these detainees speak with their lawyers. This detainee was a journalist, and this journalist told his lawyer that he witnessed the sexual assault and rape of other prisoners, you know, by either inanimate objects or at the encouraging of the soldiers by dogs. So they're using dogs to commit these horrific acts, which, I mean, is really unspeakable, right? Like, I really hope that claim isn't true, even though I've read it multiple times now. And this from Netanyahu, or not Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, almost seems to be an admission that it is. I mean, he is running these prisons. He is the person that would know. Maybe he's trying to make it seem like the conditions in these prisons are worse to intimidate Palestinians, to feed his right-wing base. I don't know. I'm trying to find a way where it could still not be true that the Israelis are using dogs to commit these crimes, but it seems more and more likely that it is. Now, aside from that, it's been more well documented, including in the New York Times, that they have used electric prods to rape people with, and this has led to the death of some detainees. There's been widespread reports from Israeli doctors who have been, serving and providing medical services in these prisons that the prisoners are kept in diapers, just sitting on the floor all day long. They're blindfolded. They're not allowed to talk to each other. They're kept not in handcuffs, but plastic zip tie restraints, and they're kept so tight that, first it causes a cut, and then because there's no medical treatment and because everybody's soiling themselves, they get infected, and then from there the infection leads either to a very serious case of an infection that leads to an amputation or sepsis and the death of the inmate. And so again, the conditions that have been described in these prisons are probably worse than Guantanamo Bay, kind of Abu Ghraib style crimes that are just rampantly committed. And again, Ben-Gvir isn't saying that, some of the most outlandish claims are false, but we are doing some pretty horrible things. He's just outright confirming that. And he's also stating, right, he's not saying that we've tried to make these, we had seen the minimal requirements. We are trying to make them minimally comfortable. He's saying we are making the conditions as worse as possible. We are denying them to the minimum rights as possible. All right. So Ben-Gvir said after the outbreak of war on October 7th, I was able to carry out the long-awaited reforms that he wanted to do. He said his conditions were reduced to a minimum, which included stopping the financial deposits, canceling the canteen for detainees, and so, having like a little prison commissary thing where people could go and I know in American prisons that's like where you get toothpaste, toothbrush, soap, things like that. I did read reports from a lot of detainees that said the Israelis will say like you have 8 minutes to take a shower or something like that, but they don't give them a clock or a warning, and if you go over the time you're allotted to take your shower, they viciously beat you. So a lot of the detainees just stopped showering because, you're opening yourself up for a pretty severe beating because you don't have a clock. It's cruel. It's torture. Removing electronic devices from, this is bad to the Ben-Gvir saying what he reduced to a minimum. He removed the electronic devices from prison cells, dramatically reduced the time in showers, converting the indulgent food menu into a minimal menu, among other measurements. The security minister said the prisons of the state of Israel are no longer a sad joke. He pointed out, I never thought of releasing terrorists from prison because they are crowded, adding, this is the core dispute between me and the Shin Bet chief, Ronan Bar. He said Bar claims the conditions of the terrorists in the prison, including overcrowding, look bad in the world and may lead to escalation. I claim that if any country in the world were to do what is done to us, it would do many times more against those terrorists. And, this is, Ben-Gvir is just a sick, depraved man. Ben-Gvir said that despite more prisons already in the process of being constructed, it was still very possible that after the additional prisons, many of the terrorists will still be overcrowded in the prisons. And this is what he wrote in his tweet. I have already proposed a much simpler solution, enacting the death penalty for terrorists, which would solve the overcrowding issue, legislation which the Shin Bet is also vehemently opposed. Which, the first time he said it was shocking and disturbing. That he continues to restate this is just unbelievable. Ben-Gvir has made similar statements on April 17th on Ed, stating the death penalty for terrorism is the right solution to the incarceration problem. The Turkish news agency reported that on Sunday, he said in a video that prisoners should be shot in the head instead of given more food. He emphasized his support for a bill proposed by his right-wing Asma Yahut Party, which is the Jewish Power Party, which calls for executing Palestinian prisoners, stating they should be killed with a shot to the head, and a bill to execute Palestinian prisoners must be passed in the third reading in the Knesset. Until then, we will give them minimal food to survive. I do not care about this. I mean, again, those are all his words, so there's really not a whole lot to say. And then this one here, Israel abusing detained Palestinian women. And these women are particularly pregnant, which makes it even worse. So this from the New Arab. The Israeli army has detained at least 2 pregnant women in Damun prison since October 7th, according to the Palestinian Commission for the Affairs of Palestinian Prisoners and ex-prisoners. Writing on Telegram, the group stated that the 2 women, Jahad Nakala and Ashia Gehand, are among 7 detainees currently under investigation by Israeli forces. Overall, there are 78 female detainees in the Damun prison, including 3 from the Strip. The group also revealed that the women are subject to abuses, including starvation and isolation. And I would imagine both of those things would have pretty negative impacts on a pregnancy, if not leading to some kind of miscarriage, probably, deficiencies for the fetus, which will eventually, lead to different challenges for the baby. So the Palestinian Commission of prisoners and ex-prisoners said they have been completely isolated from the outside world and deprived of their simplest rights, such as clothes and medical care, in spite of serious health conditions and those who have chronic diseases. Furthermore, they are subjected to physical abuse and suppression since the beginning of their arrest, in addition to sexual harassment during strip searches and other threats, adding the policy of abuse and punishment against female detainees have increased since October 7th. Experts for the United Nations called for an independent probe into the Israeli abuses against Palestinian women and girls, including killings and rapes of sexual assault, pointing out the arbitrary detention of hundreds of Palestinian women and girls. Palestinian women released from Israeli jails have told the New Arab that they were further deprived of water, electricity, sunlight, and medical treatment after Israel launched this war on Gaza. The Palestinian Commission for the Affairs of Prisoners and Ex-Prisoners also noted that the army intends to crack down on female detainees as summer approaches with soaring temperatures by closing rooms with no ventilation and confiscating fans. Rooms were also overcrowded, and the jailers intended to close the narrow windows to each door to prevent air from passing through. The Palestinian Prisoner Society reported that there are almost 9,300 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons and detention centers, including 250 children prisoners and 75 women, while 3,400 Palestinians are placed under administrative detention, which allows Palestinians to be detained without trial or charge. All right, now let's move on and talk about the situation in Lebanon, which seems very not good here. This one, Dave DeCamp, July 2nd. Former U.S. intelligence analyst says Israel risking war in Lebanon for Netanyahu's political survival. A former U.S. military intelligence analyst has warned that Israel is risking a major war in Lebanon for Netanyahu's political survival. It's former U.S. Army Major Harrison Mann, who resigned from the Pentagon Defense Intelligence Agency earlier this year over the U.S. backing of the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, and has been speaking out against President Biden's policy of full-throated support for Israel. In comments made to The Guardian, Mann said, "We know specifically that the Israeli Prime Minister must continue to be a wartime leader if he wants to prolong his political career and stay out of court, so that motivation is there." His comments echo those from the Washington Post that was published at the beginning of the year. It said U.S. officials are concerned Netanyahu might view a war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. Mann said he expects Israel to target residential areas in southern Lebanon in the event of a full-blown war, a tactic known as the Dahali Doctrine, named after a neighborhood in Beirut that Israel bombarded in 2016. So Mann said, it's not like an actual written doctrine, but I think we can be very comfortable in assessing that bombing civilian centers as a way to compel the enemy is clearly accepted and shared belief in the IDF and Israeli leadership. We've just seen them do it in Gaza for the past 9 months. He warned that Hezbollah would be able to hit back hard against Israel. He said they probably had the ability to at least partially overwhelm Israel's air defenses, strike certain civilian infrastructure around the country, and inflict a level of destruction that I'm not sure Israel has ever really experienced in its history, and certainly not its recent history. Mann said that the heavy bombardment of Israeli cities would make it more likely that the U.S. would get directly involved. Our least escalatory option will be possibly shrinking supply lines or associated targets in Iraq and Syria to help cut off lines of communication and armaments flowing to Hezbollah. But that on its own is risky, because if we start doing that, some of these people we hit could be Hezbollah, they could be the IRGC, the Iran Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, Mann said. And then, of course, we're essentially just direct parties to the conflict. Iran warned Israel that a full-scale assault on Lebanon would lead to an obliterating war in the region. It's unclear if Iran would intervene directly, but it's likely that the allied Shia militias in Iraq and Syria would get involved, and have said they would. Mann said he doesn't expect the Biden administration to choose to target Iran directly, but warned the risk of a direct U.S.-Iran war would increase significantly. He said, I trust the administration not to do that, but I think it's been us or the Israelis striking Iranian targets outside of Iran. The risk of escalation is going to become much higher. The U.S. claims it is working hard to avoid a war in Lebanon, but it continues to provide strong support for Israel, which can embolden Netanyahu to escalate the situation. Middle East Eye recently reported that the U.S. conveyed to Lebanon that it would ultimately support Israel if a full-blown war breaks out. Additionally, the White House, while working hard, is really only working hard at pressuring other parties and not leveraging any pressure on Israel. And so, last story up here today, this one again, Dave DeCamp. Hezbollah says Gaza ceasefire needs to end conflict on Israel-Lebanon border. So the deputy leader of Lebanon's Hezbollah reiterated on Tuesday that attacks on northern Israel would only end if there is a ceasefire in Lebanon or in Gaza. So this is Hezbollah Deputy Secretary General Sheikh Nam Qassam, and he said, if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, we will stop without any discussion. Qassam said that if Israeli military operations in Gaza wind down without formal ceasefire or Israeli withdrawal, it's unclear what Hezbollah would do. If it happens in Gaza is a mix between a ceasefire and no ceasefire, war and no war, we can't answer how we would react now because we don't know its shape, its results, its impacts, which is more along the lines of what Israel has talked about. And I had kind of viewed this as a problem for Hezbollah because it's not like Israel would even maybe have soldiers on the ground in Gaza, but if they're bombing the strip daily, if they're still preventing food and other aid from entering the strip, well then the situation is essentially almost as bad for the people of Gaza. So would they stop the fighting at that point? I'm not so sure. The comments come as tensions on the Israel-Lebanon border are soaring, and Israeli officials are increasing threats about potential invasion. It's unclear if a ceasefire in Gaza would de-escalate the situation, as the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said earlier this year that a truce in Gaza would mean escalation in Lebanon, and that's a remark that he's repeated several times. Qassam said he doesn't believe Israel has the ability to launch a full-scale assault on Lebanon at the moment, and warned a limited incursion would result in a major regional escalation. Israel can decide what it wants, limited war, total war, partial war, but it should not expect that our response and our resistance will be within a ceiling and rules of engagement set by Israel. If Israel wages war, it means it doesn't control its extent or who enters it. According to a tally from AFP, Israel strikes on Lebanon since October 7th had killed 493 people, including 95 civilians. On the Israeli side of the border, at least 15 soldiers and 11 civilians have been killed by Hezbollah fighter. I've seen that number slightly higher, closer to 30 than 26, but significantly lower than the Hezbollah number either way. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. Again, we'll either be back Thursday or Friday with a new show. Hope you all enjoy your 4th of July.